مرحبا بكم مشاهدينا في حوارات السياق. في تصعيد جديد بتونس تشن القوات الأمنية حملة اعتقالات منذ أيام شملت قيادات حزبية وقضاة وإعلاميين ورجال أعمال في ظل الأزمة السياسية الحادة التي تعيشها البلاد منذ شروع الرئيس قيس سعيد بفرض إجراءات استثنائية في يوليو من عام 2021. للمزيد من المتابعة حول هذا الملف ينضم إلينا الأستاذ فرانسيس جيليز، باحث أول في مركز برشلونة الدولي. أستاذ فرانسيس، مرحبا بك معنا.
Thank you to be with you for inviting me.
ما الذي يحدث في تونس؟ حملة لمحاربة الفساد أم تصفية للمعارضة؟
Well, it's not really a plan to fight corruption because you can't spend the last few years, as the president has done, denouncing corruption and plots. And then when you arrest people, some people who've been arrested, you could argue that they deserve a trial and that they probably are corrupt, but other people are being arrested, like journalists. They're not corrupt, they're just being arrested to block freedom of expression. So this kind of populism doesn't work very well, and I don't think it convinces anybody.
أستاذ فرانسيس، جدير بالتنويه هنا أن الدولة تقول إنها تلاحقهم بتهمة التآمر. القضاء يفترض أنه الفاصل في الأمر أم أن نزاهة القضاء مشكوك فيها في تونس؟
Oh yes, I mean the Tunisian judiciary sometimes is good, but sometimes has been very corrupt. I mean, ever since the Ben Ali days, so that's not a question. But basically what we're facing is that the president has taken all powers for himself in the last year and a half. And I must say the last 10 years in Tunisia have not been an exercise in democracy, but in blocking reforms, in corruption, in foreign money and Tunisian money investing politics. There have been no reforms. There have been no reforms in the economy and no reforms in the security sector. So in a way, what we're seeing with the current president is the result of 10 years of very corrupt politicians, of refusal to implement or to discuss reforms seriously, of pretending to make reforms to get money from the International Monetary Fund, but in fact stalling. And the same people who own the assets of Tunisia 12 or 13 years ago own them today. There are few new people who've come into the game, but the oligarchy has not changed. So any idea that Tunisia was progressing on a democratic path, to my way of thinking, has been eyewash. You know, it hasn't been true. Everybody's been talking about Tunisia, the beacon of democracy. But in the last few years, even well before Kais Saied, there was no move to reform, no move to fight corruption from any president in Tunisia since the revolution. So in a way, Kais Saied, I must say, he believes in conspiracies. I don't believe he has any economic vision for Tunisia. He now accuses black immigrants of risking the Arab and Islamic culture of Tunisia, which doesn't make sense at all because 20,000 black people, many of whom are well accepted in Tunisia, can't put in danger 12 million people in one of the oldest Arab states in the world. So it's populism, naked populism, and it will only lead to more trouble.
مؤيدو الرئيس يقولون إن التحقيقات والملاحقات ثورة في عمل القضاء التونسي الذي أهمل لسنوات قضايا الفساد من دون حساب. أعتقد أنك تتفق مع هذا.
Well, they do have a point that the Tunisian judiciary, part of it, not all of it, one's got to be very careful. There are plenty of judges and magistrates who are clean, but there are also corrupt magistrates. And for instance, the fact that those who murdered the left-wing members of parliament, Shukri Alwi, and one of his friends in 2013, they've never been found or brought to court after 10 years. So clearly there is a major problem with the judiciary. Also, when the Islamist party Nahda was in power, they tried to build a parallel state in the Ministry of the Interior and in the courts. And this further complicated the issue. But having said that, it's not because the judiciary is not perfect. It's not because some of the journalists are corrupt that you start arresting people right, left, and center, and in the middle of the night, and with no transparency whatsoever. Because when you arrest the head of Radio Mosaic, which is the most listened to radio station in Tunisia, who's clearly doing a reasonably good job, that's got nothing to do about fighting corruption. It's got everything to do with shutting people up.
نعم، لكن الدولة قالت إن الاعتقالات استهدفت شبكة انقلاب على الرئيس. هل هذا يعني أن الأقربين انفضوا من حوله؟
The alleged coup, when you allege a coup, you've got to bring proof. If you don't bring proof, then your alleged coup is just that, a figment of your imagination. And the president spends his time denouncing conspiracies from the left, from the right, from Europe, from whoever you want, but he never brings any proof. So at one point, you just have to ask, is this not a method of repression, a method of government? And this is what it is more and more looking like.
باعتقادك هل يتم توظيف أخطاء الرئيس من قبل معارضي تنظيم الإخوان مثلا لمصلحتهم السياسية؟
Well, I think that basically a lot of young Tunisians who voted for Sayed in 2019 when he was elected on a landslide. And many young Tunisians despaired at the corruption, at the lack of reforms of the years before, voted for him in the belief that he would put order into this. I myself wrote that this is the last chance to put some order in all this, so long as he listens to people, enacts major economic reforms. In his entourage, he has very few people who are competent, who are good. He thinks on his own. We do not know who advises him on many things. The palace is very, how can I say, opaque. Never has the palace in Carthage been so opaque. We don't know. And then he makes his speeches in rigid classical Arabic, and he never proposes anything. He denounces conspiracies. When the price of milk or butter or whatever goes up, he says it's a conspiracy. Well, it's not a conspiracy. He denounces speculators. Well, sure, they're speculators. But if you've got a war in Ukraine, if you've got senior civil service, which is totally demoralized, if you have ministers who, on the most part, are incompetent, then inevitably it's pointless to say conspiracies. It's the conspiracy of mediocrity. That's what it is. And that's much more dangerous because in Tunisia, for all the problems of Tunisia, the Tunisian population is educated. There are plenty of good economists in Tunis, men and women, who could advise the president, who could speak if he wanted to listen to them. But he just doesn't want to listen to anybody. He listens to what's in his own head. And, this is a very sad state of affairs, particularly for somebody who, for many years, was a lecturer in law, in constitutional law. Well, I don't know what he's kept of all these years of lecturing on constitutional law. Clearly not much.
إذا كان الرئيس لا يسمع إلا لنفسه، ما خيارات التونسيين للتعامل مع هذه الأوضاع؟
Well, the Tunisian people, the standard of living is going down. The average Tunisian has got much poorer since 2011. So at one point, you could get social disturbances. We don't know. We could get rioting again because people are suffering. The average Tunisian is suffering. The middle class is shrinking. The poverty of the inland of Tunisia, the south of Tunisia, which was such a marked feature, a richer coastline and a poorer hinterland, that's got worse in the last 10 years. So all the problems that existed when Ben Ali left have only got worse. Meanwhile, the debt the foreign debt has exploded. The civil service has gone up from 500,000 to about 650,000 people. The budget is being used to pay civil servants. It's not being made to invest. They've stopped investment in infrastructure. The standard of education is going down. The standard of hospitals is going down. Everything that the first president of Tunisia built, Habib Bourguiba, in the 50s and 60s and 70s and 80s, is shrinking, is disappearing, is going down the drain. So at one point, there could be trouble in the street, or there could be trouble from another sector, but that we don't know, and I don't want to speculate. The president is heavily dependent on the security forces, which are diverse, and on the army, which until a year and a half ago had remained neutral in Tunisian politics. The army, a year and a half ago, backed Kais Saied. But at one point, the question is, will one of these gentlemen in the security forces or the army decide enough is enough? That's pure speculation at the moment. But if you look around you in the Arab world or in the European world, whatever, that's usually what happens. At one point, somebody blows the whistle and says, well, it's the end of the game, back to serious business. So what will happen, we do not know.
بما أنك جئت على ذكر الأزمة الاقتصادية، هل تقضي قرارات الرئيس على فرص تونس في الحصول على قرض صندوق النقد الدولي؟
Well, at the moment, the president doesn't seem to care one way or the other whether he gets the IMF loan. I mean, that's the way he's behaving. They sometimes hint in his entourage that he could get money from the Gulf or China. Maybe he could. Maybe he already has. I don't know. But I mean, nothing will replace the IMF green light to get the green light from the IMF to get another loan. But the problem is that the IMF has been lending money to Tunisia since 2014. Every promise the Tunisian government, successive governments have made to the IMF in the last 9 years have been broken. And my contention from 2014 is that successive Tunisian governments have never had the slightest intention of respecting the IMF rules. So the problem is, why is the IMF, why is the West backing Tunisia? And I think there are 2 or 3 reasons, which are quite simple. One, Tunisia was deemed to be the only country in the Arab world progressing towards democracy. Right. So I never believed that. I didn't believe that from very, but they believed it. Many people believed it. And so they went along with this kind of illusion. Secondly, Tunisia is not, if you look at the world in the last 10 years, Tunisia is not the most important country. Its stability is important because if it goes belly up, I don't know what happens. But when you look at, we've got Ukraine at the moment, you've got all the crisis in the Middle East and the Gulf, everywhere. You've got crisis all over the world. So in a way, I think the West seems to be shrugging its shoulders and saying, oh, well, who cares? Tunisia's together. We'll just lend a bit of money and we'll keep the show on the road. But the problem is the show is going off the road. So I think there's a mixture of hypocrisy on the part, not just of the West, but also the Middle East. But there's also an ignorance of Tunisia, because I've known Tunisia, I'm 78, I've known Tunisia since I was 7. I know the country dearly, and I love Tunisia very, very much. But many people go to Tunisia, the coastal resorts in Tunis, and they think they know Tunisia. Tunisia may be only 12 million people. They are all Sunnis, so they're quite unified in a way. But Tunisia is very different from one region to another, from the north to the south. Tunisia, like any country, is a very complex country. And people go and they say, oh, yes, women are emancipated. Look at this, look at that. And you say, sure, women are emancipated, but they are not equal to men. Because if you start looking at the way Tunisian society functions, Tunisian society is very conservative, naturally, very, very conservative. It's tolerant, it's open. Because maybe like in the Gulf, if you're a trading nation, and Tunisia has been based on great trading ports, Sousse, Sfax, Tunis, since the Carthaginians, if you're trading, you tend to be tolerant and open because you're receiving foreigners. So, but Tunisia is a very complex country, and the lack of reform, the sheer incompetence, not just corruption, but the incompetence of President Marzouki, of President Béjicaï Essebsi, of the current president, accumulate all the complications. It's a very layered it's become so complicated. Some leading Tunisians I speak to don't even know where to start with the reform. So we're in a huge mess, and messes tend to end up in a bad way.
الرئيس التونسي دفع جل اهتمامه نحو السياسة وأهمل الاقتصاد. هل ترتيب أولوياته مصيب هنا؟
Well, the president has focused on the political system because it's been a way of gaining more political power. But the last election showed, the second round of the parliamentary elections, 10% of the people voted. So people don't even vote. They don't care. They couldn't care less. They're just surviving. The president is totally ignorant in matters of economics. And if you're totally ignorant and you're not interested, he tried to block the price of certain staple goods in the shops. You can't block the prices by presidential decree. They go up or down, not just because of speculation, because they're available or not. Tunisia no longer has the money to import many parts it needs for its industry. And soon it won't have enough money to import wheat. The price of wheat has gone up. And meanwhile, the president just never holds any sensible discourse on economics. He just denounces speculation and corruption and conspiracy. Well, you can't rule a country just by denouncing corruption and conspiracies, because there may be corruption, there may be conspiracies, but there is a real economic machine which is grinding to a halt. And that, at one point, will blow up in his face. How? We do not know. The other point is in foreign affairs, where the president has done two things in the last year which are really very sad. One is the way he's gone and denounced the 20,000 black immigrants, many of whom are illegal, who are in his country. And it's beginning to sound like Madame Le Pen in France, or some of the right-wing racists in America. So for a man like that, who's a lecturer in constitutional law and a Tunisian who's tolerant, to sound like a right-wing American or a right-wing Frenchman or some of the harder racists in Europe, is very uncomfortable, including for many Tunisians, because they may not like the fact that they're these black people, but I've seen many of them. Some of my friends employ black people to help them. So it's very uncomfortable to have racism come out of the mouth of the head of state. Secondly, last summer, there was a big tech conference sponsored by the Japanese, and the president received the president of the Saharan Arab Republic, right? We won't go into the Western Sahara. He had no reason to receive this man with full honors. I doubt very much whether the Algerians who support the West Saharan independence asked him to do that. In the process, he made relations with Morocco much worse. For what purpose? Why did he do it? It's never been explained. What he did is totally absurd. Diplomatically, it doesn't make any sense. It's not going to change the question of the Western Sahara. And as a result, he's broken basically relations with Morocco, which is an important country. And it just looks plain stupid. And so at one point you have to ask, is the man, is there a screw loose? What's going on? And I don't think anybody knows, really. So there is a rigidity about him. He doesn't listen to people. And we know that in the palace in Carthage, some of his advisors, we do not know the names. If you look at the government, they don't shine by their competence, to put it mildly. It's probably the most incompetent government, with one or two exceptions, in modern Tunisian history. So it's a very strange state of affairs.
لكن هناك من سيجادلك أنه عين امرأة على رأس الحكومة.
Well, I don't buy that one again at all. I tell you why, because I very much believe, President Bourguiba gave women equal rights, and there's no doubt he did a lot for women in Tunisia. And when you go to Tunis, anywhere in Tunisia, women, more than in any other Arab country, they may not be equal, but by God, they're partners, they fight, they speak, they're not afraid to speak. But at the same time as this woman was appointed, his chef de cabinet was a woman who actually dictated things. So the woman who had the power was not visible. And then he goes and appoints a token woman. I do not believe in tokenism. There are plenty of competent men and women in Tunisia. And if you want to form a government in Tunisia, which is, say, 50% women, and have very competent people, you would have no problem at all. They're engineers, doctors, teachers. Tunisian women, that you could appoint a government of women in Tunisia, be top-notch competent. There's no problem at all. So this kind of tokenism, personally, leaves me completely cold. Because, it doesn't mean anything. And it's true everywhere. Of course, women should get more jobs, senior jobs. I would simply ask, isn't it about time that a woman became president of Tunisia? Because there's some women I know who would be far more competent presidents of Tunisia than the current incumbent.
بعد هذه التطورات في تونس، المثال الذي كان يشاد به عند الحديث عما يعرف بالربيع العربي، هل يمكن الجزم الآن أنه كان خرابا ودمارا وتراجعا على العالم العربي؟
I think to come back to Tunisia, I think the sad point about Tunisia is that the revolt in Tunisia happened without outside interference. It was homegrown. But let me say, it was not a revolution. It was a revolt which decapitated the head of Tunisia and his corrupt family. It was not a revolution. The property, the assets remained in the same hands. Nonetheless, there was some hope. The fact that 12 years after the Tunisian revolt, or the Jasmine Revolution, if you want to call it by that way, we have lost any hope at all, is for me a subject of great sadness. But since about 2013, for the last 10 years, I have been one of the probably few saying this is not going to end well if certain key reforms are not made in security and in economic and social affairs. The Tunisian elite has failed its people completely. The new political class is not a political class. They're just jumped up, whatever they are, but they've been incapable of summing up what was right, what was wrong with Tunisia, and coming forward with some serious proposals for reform. And this includes everybody. It includes the Islamists who never intended to have political reform in any case. It includes the trade unions. The trade unions in Tunisia are powerful, but they only represent those who work in the state sector, i.e. 500,000 people in 2011, 650,000 now. They do not represent the workers in all the private industries. They do not represent people who have part-time jobs. They do not represent the thousands of small entrepreneurs, men and women, who are the backbone of Tunisia, who run companies of 4 or 5 people. The unions have just played it for their own gain. The first thing President Kais Saied could do if he wanted to fight corruption is take the 150,000 people who've been appointed since 2011 to civil service jobs. We know that 38 or 40,000 of these people have fake university degrees, fake professional qualification. Sack them overnight and don't give them any money and publish their fake degrees. Everybody knows it. If you want to fight corruption, do that. If you have trouble, you have trouble. And we know that this question of people who've been recruited who don't even have the degrees they pretend to have. They're not all Islamists. There are plenty of Islamists, but there are other people as well from other, start somewhere. But if you want to fight corruption, you have to bring the proof of what you're doing. If you arrest people, you've got to bring them to trial. You've got to have due process. You've got to have a minimum of transparency. So either you have the proof or you don't. If you don't, then it's pure demagoguery, and it's very dangerous because conspiracy theories, as we know, be it in Europe or in the Arab world, they're very easy to spread. It's so easy to say it's a conspiracy. Well, the conspiracy in Tunisia is the mediocrity of the ruling class of Tunisia And it is the immense mediocrity and incompetence of the president. That is the conspiracy which is destroying Tunisia. It's not foreigners, whatever the fault of foreigners or what they've done. The problem is in Tunis, with the Tunisian elite, with the Tunisian people. And I am convinced that only they can solve it. Maybe with some help from the West or the Gulf, if they could come up with a good plan, really good plan, courageous, and then turn to the Middle East and the IMF and Europe and say, would you finance that? If you had a serious plan, then maybe people would say, yeah, we're prepared to put a few $1 billion. Yeah, sure. But nobody in Tunisia, no president, no government has ever presented a blueprint for reform since the fall of Ben Ali. And this president, even less than any others. So that's the sorry state of affairs we're in. It's a sorry state of affairs because the Tunisian people, whom I dearly respect, deserve much, much better than that.
أستاذ فرانسيس جيليز، شكرا جزيلا لك للمشاركة معنا في حوارات السياق.
My pleasure.
مشاهدينا، شكرا على طيب المتابعة. إلى الملتقى.